Right, welcome back. The chatter can dissipate. I'm the chatter dissipating man. Welcome back. Very pleased to be helming, moderating, hosting this next session. Reimagine series, Geopolitics in the New Competitive Era. Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former UK Foreign Secretary and also visiting professor at King's College London. He became an MP back in 1974. 1974. I was 4 then, just so you all know. And Ashok Malik, who's our virtual guest, Policy Advisor, Ministry of External Affairs of India. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. So Malcolm, if I can start with you, like I said, Defense Secretary, Foreign Secretary, there are others, but there's too many titles
Thank you very
much. You've seen a lot, you've worn the T-shirt, you made the T-shirt, you've experienced many, let's call them geopolitical eras. I want to start with India and the UK. How do you see the UK-India relationship right now from where you're sitting?
Well, obviously there's the historical association, and that's never going to be forgotten either by India or the United Kingdom. But what we have also is a contemporary relationship, partly through the Commonwealth, partly through shared interests. And you know, in this difficult world in which we live, India is one of the countries with the greatest potential of all. And that's seen in the United Kingdom. And let me just give one obvious example of that, at least I hope it's obvious. That, you know, there's a lot of talk about China. India is the same size as China in terms of population, actually overtaking China. It's a huge country, but it has one enormous strength that China doesn't have. India is governed by the rule of law. It has a political system which rests on the consent of the people. Now, in the modern world in which we live, that gives India a moral authority that an authoritarian state can never claim. And that is why I'm hugely confident that India will take its place, a deserved place, as one of the great nations, already is one of the great nations of the world, but one of the really leading nations of the world. And the United Kingdom, as one of the largest economies in the world, it's still a major power, not the same as it used to be in the days of empire, but still a major country. They're natural partners. The English language draws us together. I first went to India when I was a student at the age of 17. I traveled overland to India. And I've never forgotten that experience.
What are your prime memories from then, Sir Malcolm? We like to make this about the personal, the IGF. Give me a few memories from 17 in India.
Well, when we got to India, we drove all the way through the Middle East, through Iran, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan to India. And sadly, 4 days after we got to India, the Indian-Pakistani war broke out, one of the wars over Kashmir. And I was farmed out. We were all farmed out to local families. And I was farmed out to a family where the husband was a senior Indian civil servant and the wife was Scottish from Edinburgh, my hometown. So we had porridge for breakfast and curry for lunch.
Sounds like a dream.
That's what I remember.
Yeah. It's funny what one remembers. Ashok, Sir Malcolm has a wonderful, positive, all-embracing viewpoint of this UK-India relationship. How do you see things?
Thanks, Mark, Sir Malcolm, and thank you to IGF for having me here. I must confess you're not very audible. I think you're asking me for my view on the UK-India relationship. Look, this is a moment of great change for the global system and for our the UK is looking to balance its European identity and European responsibilities with a more global approach, including in the Indo-Pacific and Asia. India is trying to do just the opposite. It's trying to balance its natural home in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific with a more robust relationship with the West. I think we're both looking externally, we're both looking globally, and we see each other as natural partners. Not just in the sense of the English language, history, the Westminster model of democracy and all of that. That's a given. But quite frankly, despite our history, we've underperformed in terms of our bilateral, in terms of our economic relations in the past few decades, in terms of reaching anywhere close to potential on trade, on technology cooperation, and so on. I'm confident the free trade agreement we are negotiating, while it may not be a maximalist free trade agreement, would still give us enough to work on together for ourselves and for the world. And some of the crises we are currently encountering as a global community, the health crisis, including the pandemic and future pandemics and preparing for future pandemics, climate change and the need for green technologies. These are areas where India and the UK are natural partners because India has innovation capacities, as does the UK. The UK has, of course, technology which it can offer the world. And India has scale. If we work together, there's a lot we can. I'll give you one example. There's a British company called JCB, which manufactures in India. If JCB manufactured just in the UK, it would be competitive in 10 or 12 countries in the world. Because JCB manufactures in India, it can sell a British technology or British product to 100 countries. That's the sort of advantage we have if we collaborate and bring our strengths together. And that's really where the future lies.
That's interesting. Collaboration, it's so important. It's going to be something we touch on throughout the next day and tomorrow as well. So Malcolm, because the title of this is Reimagine Geopolitics, let's dig back into the geopolitics. There's going to be lots of discussions about the collaboration, technology, climate, and all those sorts of things over the next day or so. We're in an uncertain geopolitical climate, Sir Malcolm, and on our doorstep in Europe, we have a war raging, which is causing great concern. How alarmed are you by this period we seem to be living in where geopolitical tensions are on the rise, not just globally, but here on our doorstep in Europe?
I'm deeply worried by it, but one has to put these things in perspective. For most of the history of the last few hundred years, what we're seeing today is more normal than what we've seen in the last 30 years. What we had was this extraordinary episode in 1989 when the Cold War came to an end peacefully. And suddenly you had no Cold War and threat of nuclear holocaust. Communism disappeared as a meaningful entity, as an alternative economic theory that could affect the whole world as a whole. And then the Soviet Union imploded. It collapsed. It stopped being a superpower. It's today a very important power because of its military capability, but even that, as we have seen, is very limited. But it can damage, it can destroy, as it's doing in Ukraine. So there are these huge problems. But of course, the other big change, and it was bound to happen, is the growth of China. China is already the other superpower, not as strong as the United States, but moving in that direction. We shouldn't see this as some sort of miracle for the Chinese to have achieved this. The Chinese should have been economically where they are now 40 years ago. We've always known that to be the case, that the Chinese make very good capitalists when they're allowed to be so. But the lunacies of Mao Zedong prevented that happening. And why am I confident that they could have done it 40 years ago? Just look at other Chinese societies. Look at Taiwan. Look at Hong Kong. Look at other Asian societies like Japan and South Korea. They achieved all the prosperity China now has. They achieved it 40 years ago, and they didn't need to have a Communist Party dictatorship to do it. They've got democratic societies and the rule of law. And that's very relevant to India's future capability.
But so Malcolm, how does China use its economic and its military power?
Well, this is a great disturbing question, because when you have a new power that has a fantastic history, but went through a period of decline, which China did for well over 100 years, now it's trying to catch up. Now it's trying to reverse what happened. That's natural. But I would say the advice that Xi Jinping should be listening to, not necessarily to the United States or to the United Kingdom, he should be listening to Deng Xiaoping, who was responsible more than anyone else for the transformation of the Chinese economy when they effectively got rid of communism and introduced what they call market economics with Chinese characteristics. And he said this good number of years ago, when China becomes economically powerful, it should not throw its weight around. It shouldn't bully its neighbors. That's what Deng Xiaoping said. And that was true of his successors until Xi Jinping. And what I think, the one final point I want to make, and I'll make it briefly on this matter, is that the real concern, if I was in Beijing, is not that the United States disapproves of us, or the Europeans disapprove of us, or dare I say it, India disapproves of us. It is the fact that China has managed, under Xi Jinping, to alienate every single one of its Asian neighbors, all the way from Japan and South Korea, through Taiwan, through Vietnam and Southeast Asia, to India itself. they all now see themselves concerned about a geopolitical threat from China. That's remarkable. China, Japan and India, for the first time ever, had joint naval exercises. Their two navies exercised together. What on earth have Japan and India got in common from a naval point of view, except they both share a coastline with China, a border with China? Vietnam, think of the history of Vietnam and America. Vietnamese government said publicly, we look on America today as our partner. China's the country we're worried about. So if I was Xi Jinping in Beijing, I'd be worried about that. How have I managed to alienate all these
Let's
Asian
ask
neighbors?
Ashok, you're sitting there. How has China managed to alienate many of its Asian partners?
Well, the 2 points here. One, if you take a big picture view, every century in human history has given us a few shocks. This century, the century we are in, the 21st century, has given us a series of shocks in its first 2 decades. 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, then the 2008 global financial crisis, which led to an economic meltdown in many parts of the world, including the West. Then the COVID disruption, and now the Ukraine war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, if you look at what happened to 9/11 and when the US and the West got enmeshed in 2 wars in the Middle East and Central Asia, and then what happened in 2008 when the economic crisis gripped Europe and the US. Both of them gave China a free run, and it accumulated material power and capacity at a much faster rate than it had thought and imagined. It was a bonanza for it. Because quite frankly, many of us, and including many of our friends in the West, took their eyes off the ball because they were occupied with more pressing challenges or proximate challenges. That has given China the sort of leverage over our lives, frankly, that it should never have got. In terms of, it used to be said in the old days, centuries ago, that all roads lead to Rome. Quite frankly, all supply chains seem to have led to China in the past 20 years or 30 years. And as we've discovered in the past 2 or 3 years since COVID hit us, you are only as vulnerable as the most vulnerable link in your supply chain. And since so many of those supply chains are now controlled by China and rest in China, we've essentially been in hock to China. And China has leveraged this capacity, this power it has over us, including by resorting to very unpredictable behavior in the economic sphere, as well as in the military and maritime spheres, and in the global commons. As the world is restructuring post-COVID and post-Ukraine, we need to ensure greater global balance. We need to ensure that the dependencies we've created vis-a-vis China do not sustain into the future, because they cannot define the rest of our century and the rest of this century. We need to regain some of that balance.
Sir Malcolm, what are the difficulties in rebalancing the world away from that, the interlinkages we have with China?
Right. It's question. It is getting a new balance, not getting out of balance.
Yes.
It is basically recognizing that China cannot simply be ignored. It's not the elephant in the. It's the elephant in the room. It's too big. It's too important. That will always be the case. But there are many areas of economic activity where, as has been said very eloquently, we cannot rely on supply chains for things that are vital to our own national interests. But I think the main determinant is whether China can be persuaded to become less aggressive to its neighbors.
Can it?
I don't know. It doesn't look like it under Xi Jinping. If you think at the moment, he is threatening to invade Taiwan at some stage. He has militarized the South China Sea, which, despite being called the South China Sea, is actually closer to Southeast Asia and Indonesia and the Philippines than it is to China. And these are all tiny little islets. And what China is seeking to do is by building, controlling these islets and by building runways for aircraft and facilities for their naval ships, effectively they could control free passage right the way from Southeast Asia right up to Japan. And combined with if they were ever to take Taiwan, the consequences would be dramatic. For example, the Japanese minister, with the authority of his own government, said something that has never been said since 1945. He said, if China was to attack Taiwan, Japan would see that as a threat to its own national security.
Do you really believe that China would invade Taiwan? I mean, I hate to put probabilities on things.
I hope not.
It's been discussed, but do you put it at a high probability, like under 30, under 20, 40%?
Well, the Chinese Communist government have said now for 40 years, 50 years, Taiwan is Chinese, it must reunite with the motherland. Although the people of Taiwan clearly don't want that, and there are 20 million of them. Now, will China invade? Well, if they thought they could do it without too many serious consequences, then they might very well be tempted to if the Taiwanese refused to voluntarily allow themselves to become part of China. I think today, as we speak, I think the Chinese president is probably giving some careful thought to what lessons to learn from the Russians in Ukraine. Because one of the main problems the Russians had is, although they had this vast army, they'd never used it in a war of this scale since 1945. And it turned out to be a pretty incompetent army, as we have seen. China has not used its army at the global level for a major war since 1949, the end of the Chinese Civil War. And the Chinese have a problem that the Russians didn't. The Russians had many problems with Ukraine, but the one they didn't have is 300 miles of sea between themselves and Ukraine. They had a common border. Their troops could cross the border and be in Ukraine in 24 hours. The Chinese, to get to Taiwan, can only use either ships or aircraft to get their invading force. And it all depends on whether the United States means it when it says, if necessary, it would intervene to help Taiwan. And that would mean intercepting attempts to... So all these considerations have become much more relevant because of the invasion of Ukraine.
Do you agree, Ashok? I mean, what are the ripple effects of such an occurrence invading Taiwan? What are the ripple effects through Asia and obviously hitting India as well?
You know, I don't speculate on what China vis-a-vis Taiwan or what lessons it may have drawn from Ukraine. Because as far as we are concerned, behavior in Asia has already been a little puzzling and a little unpredictable, more than a little unpredictable. I think Ukraine and the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine war will lead to China redrawing its means, but not fundamentally amending its ends and goals. In the case of India, China tore up 4 border agreements going back almost 30 years, threw away a growing economic relationship to, out of the blue, in the middle of the COVID crisis, mass close to 100,000 troops at our border. And we still don't know why. It was probably intimidation, probably something else. We don't know what it was. We haven't got a coherent answer. And those troops are still there. So Taiwan or no Taiwan, Ukraine or no Ukraine, China in this part of the world, as Sir Malcolm pointed out, is a very, very unpredictable actor and a very puzzling actor.
Malcolm, like we said, you are Defence Secretary, Foreign Secretary and a Conservative Party Minister. When Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, went to India only a few months ago, the story almost wasn't him being in India. It was that, you know, there was a party going on during your eyebrows, you know, rise, but we've got to discuss it because I know what you feel about it. The story became him and what was happening over COVID. How much has the whole saga undermined the UK's place on the global stage?
I don't think it's undermined it, but I think it makes the task of British ministers, and particularly the Prime Minister, that little bit more difficult. Because and it doesn't just apply in Boris Johnson's case, when you get a major political figure who is mired in controversy with questions of integrity, with how long is he going to survive, and so forth, then that inevitably has an impact on that person's authority. And when they're meeting their fellow heads of state or heads of government, then the people they're meeting are always thinking, is he still going to be Prime Minister the next time I meet him? And so forth. So that is not healthy. That's, it's a distraction. The question is how you resolve that distraction. And we are...
Are you suggesting that he should not be Prime Minister?
Well, I'm not going to use this particular occasion to make
Feel
a public...
free.
To make a public...
Let's break some news.
To make a public announcement. What I would say, what should be being considered is the national interest. And the national interest is that the Prime Minister's future is resolved as quickly as possible. And that can only be done either because he has the authority of his parliamentary and ministerial colleagues,
which he barely does,
or he is losing it.
Does he have your authority?
Well, no, what I will say is I was in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet when I was Secretary of State for Scotland, and I remember vividly the end of her prime ministership. And it was when Michael Heseltine stood against her, and she defeated him in the first round, but not enough to avoid a second round. And such was the controversy that she decided to consult each of her cabinet, because without their positive support, she had concluded she could not continue. And she did that privately, and the result of that was she stepped down. So I would hope that the Prime Minister will, in one way or another, find out the private views of his ministerial colleagues. There's 60 or 70 of them. If even half of them are not supporting him, that's the end of his government. And either that means he asks them for their views, which I suspect he may not be enthusiastic to do, but there's nothing to stop them privately going and sharing their views with them if they so wish.
Ashok, I mean, this is the minutiae of British politics.
It's more than the minutiae.
I'm putting that politely. Ashok, let's look at it through an India lens. How are you viewing Boris Johnson's travails through an Indian lens?
Look, I obviously can't comment on the UK's domestic politics, and I don't want to. But democracy is messy and complicated. It's messy and complicated in the UK, in India. That's why we are democracies. That's why we can deal with messy questions. All of us can. The India-UK relationship goes beyond individual prime ministers. Of course, Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Johnson get along very well, and they've taken this relationship forward. But we are both very consequential countries to each other. We have a diaspora, an Indian diaspora in the UK that is important to both countries. We have a trade relationship that is growing. We have a technology partnership that delivered amongst the first COVID vaccine that has the promise of doing much, much more. It's a lot we share. It's a lot together for ourselves and for the world. This will continue irrespective of which government is in office, which party is in office in either country. We are strategically very important to each other and to the rebalanced world that Sir Malcolm referred to. So I wish Prime Minister Johnson luck, and I wish the UK luck. But the fact is, India and the UK are on a smooth path in terms of their partnership, irrespective of which party is in office and irrespective of what happens in the near future or the not so near future.
You do come from
That's
Scotland.
fine. So can we just make sure that they're...
You do come from Scotland. There was some big news yesterday that the First Minister wants another referendum. This is the last thing Boris Johnson needs, on top of all the other problems he's facing, whether the referendum happens or whether it means anything. Sir Malcolm Rifkin's view on the next Scottish referendum in October 2023.
Well, I think Mrs. Sturgeon is more reacting to pressure from her own party colleagues than because she seriously believes any referendum is likely. When the last referendum was held, which the Nationalists lost substantially, Mrs. Sturgeon, during that campaign and since then, has said, a referendum is something you have at most once in a generation. And a generation is a damn sight more than 8 years. She also said that we should only have another referendum. She said this 3 years ago. If it looks as though Today, 60% of Scots want independence. At the moment, they don't even have a majority wanting independence. So the answer will be there is not going to be a referendum, and certainly not for the foreseeable future. And the fundamental economic point I would make, given the nature of this audience, is that if I was turn out to be wrong, and if not only there was one, but unexpectedly the nationalists were to win that, the economic consequences are extraordinary, far worse than they would have been last time round. Because last time round we were in the European Union, and therefore there would have been no hard border between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Yeah. If Scotland was to become a separate state today, or in the next 2 or 3 years, she would cease being part of the United Kingdom's internal market, but she would not automatically be a member of the European Union either, because it takes years to become a member of the European Union, and the Spanish would almost certainly veto it because of Catalonia. They don't want to create a precedent. So Scotland, with only 5 million people, would be in a pretty lonely position with a hard border between Scotland and England, and not in the European Union. Now, if it was to be determined on economic grounds, the nationalists would be thrashed. But of course, we know that in referendums, as we saw with Brexit, it's not just economics that necessarily are relevant to every person.
Gentlemen, it's been wonderful. I could talk to you both for hours. Sadly, I'm constrained by the time, please. But Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Foreign Secretary of the UK, visiting Professor, King's College London, and Ashok, wonderful to have you virtually. Ashok Malik, Policy Advisor, Ministry of External Affairs of India. Right back, we've got Edie joining you once again. We're going to focus on shaping our common digital futures. I want to thank our partners again, including one of our most long-standing partners and one of India's most recognisable brands, Tata. See you in a second.
Can you sit on the other side of the stage, please? Opposite side of the stage, please. Sit opposite side of the stage from where I was.